we just watched the State of the Union. We sit through it, so you don't have to. And what did we learn? What does our studio audience think? Who was in... I thought it was, in many ways, his best speech ever. But we'll hear more from the audience later. But first, let's hear from our liberty-loving panel. Cato Institute economist Dan Mitchell, the managing editor of Reason magazine, Catherine Mangu Ward, and the creator of the Libertarian Republic news site, Austin Peterson. So, Austin, were you more impressed than the audience?
More bored. You know, when you look at the speech, the president was very duplicitous. He brought up a lot of things like health care and energy and the economy. The president wants to take credit for all the good things that happen, but he doesn't want any of the credit for the bad things that happen. You know, this is the guy that has had the food stamp rolls increased 45% since he took office. But you don't hear him talking about that, or that the home ownership is lowest in the 20 years. So he just wants to talk about all the flowery, nice things. But how come he doesn't talk about that stuff?
Catherine?
You know, this was my least favorite Obama. It was the kind of like Papa Obama telling you how you should behave. We're apparently a tight-knit family, but he doesn't really like us cynical teenagers. He doesn't like the recalcitrant Republicans. He knows what's best for us. This is the sort of, you know, State of the Union as, you know, speech that you get before you get grounded. I was not a fan.
Dan?
I guess what struck me is that you have to at least give Obama credit for being consistent. Every single State of the Union address, bigger government, more dependency, Uncle Sugar Daddy giving us free stuff. And that's really, that should be the tombstone on the Obama presidency. Free stuff as we become Greece.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say, I had high hopes for Jody Ernst, and President Obama can talk circles around her. But let's cut away from our panel for a moment and go to one of the brand new Republican members of Congress, Lee Zeldon of New York. Congressman, you were in the room, and watching on TV, it looked as if both Republicans and Democrats applauded, except for John Boehner, who looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. But did both parties applaud?
Well, yeah, it really depended on what the president was talking about. I mean, there were times where the president was saying that we need to hire more vets. If you're an employer, you want to get stuff done, hire a veteran. That got every one of us up and applauding. But other times where, you know, the president wants to talk about how there's, you know, free community college coming, and, you know, half of us are asking how are you going to pay for it. It sounds good. But there's concern not only for people who are looking to go to college, but also our children and that next generation will be inheriting mountains of debt. So what you see is on many of the initiatives that the president was outlining, half of the crowd, the Democrats, standing up and applauding, and the rest of us will say, hey, great idea about how you're going to pay for it. You're talking about minimum wage and saying, you know, if you're working full time and you're taking care of family, $15,000 isn't enough to get by. Well, I'm from New York. You could be working full time, making $40,000 or $50,000, and you're struggling to get by. So is the president saying that we should increase minimum wage to $40 an hour?
That may come next year. Your staff told us you worry most about America's debt, and it's the fact that it's unsustainable, but the most unsustainable part is entitlements. Are you prepared to make cuts to the big programs like Medicare?
Hey, you know, take a look at Medicaid, for example. You have individuals making tens of millions of dollars off of Medicaid. And you'll see an announcement where maybe some attorney general or some state comptroller may be going after the dentist who is charging for 11 cavities when he only did one, and trying to, you know, get the $10,000 or $15,000 back, while you have others in these schemes where they're able to literally milk tens of millions of dollars off of Medicaid. So what happens is you have these constituencies attached to it. In 1199 SEIU and certain hospital associations may be working together and you know, creating for-profits and not-for-profits.
All true, but the big one is Medicare, not Medicaid. Medicare, which covers all the elderly. Would you cut anything?
Yeah, and I think, well, listen, I remember when my grandfather, he needed a donut because he was getting up there in age. Signing off on paperwork for $450 for something you can buy at CVS for $25. I think we have to look at the providers. I think every time that you have a business where the person signing your check is the one who doesn't have to pay the bills, like Medicare, you have room for abuse from the people providing the services, providing the items. So I think we really need to look at the purchasing of Medicare. And I think that we also regionally need to look at the payment schemes that we have. I'm from Long Island, where the cost of living is a little bit higher, and the SGR and the reimbursement formulas. But if you want to save money in Medicare, I think that we really need to look at the provider end of things. And instead of going after the low-hanging fruit, where someone might be skimming $50,000, and especially when you see government going after a patient who's taking advantage of the system, that's important for accountability and deterrence. But you have individuals running companies scheming a lot of money off of Medicare, and that's not what this program is intended for.
Right.
Same thing as Medicaid. We see a lot of abuse of Medicare.
Thank you, Congressman Zeldon. Welcome to Congress. Now, enough from politicians. Let's go back to our panel. So you have hopes for this new Republican group?
You should never have hopes for a new Republican group. It will always break your heart. I mean, this is a moment when you realize, Republicans maybe are saying things that sound a little bit better.
Yes, a lot better. They're really more
State of the
serious.
Union, it sounded like she was saying, okay, let's be more fiscally sensible. But in fact, when it comes down to it, Republicans get into power and they are pretty much just as bad as Democrats when it comes to crony capitalism, when it comes to special deals, when it comes to, actually, for instance, writing a budget, passing a budget. Republicans have been just as bad as Democrats at that. I wish I could feel hopeful, but I don't.
I wish you could feel hopeful. Dan, as the economist here, the president talked a lot about the economic recovery, which sounded like he did it. Your thoughts?
If this is an economic recovery, he needs to answer for the fact that median household income has fallen every year of his presidency. The labor force participation rate is at the lowest level in almost 4 decades. Those are big problems. Yes, we're doing better than Europe, but that's sort of like saying you're the tallest midget in the circus. It's not really a big achievement. But I do want to say something vaguely nice about Republicans. For 5 years, ever since 2009, they've frozen spending. The sequester, the government shutdown fights, the debt limit battles, they've actually paid off.
We have a chart on this.
And that's a real achievement. And even though I joke that sometimes in Washington you have the evil party and the stupid party.
Put the other chart, put the percent employed back up, because, Dan, you also mentioned the unemployment rate. The president takes credit. I've reduced it. So it was 10%. Now it's only 5.5%. Well, it was 10% because he took office during the recession. And the percentage of people who are employed is way down. People don't even look for jobs.
Two things. The labor force participation rate that you're talking about is critical, because we don't get economic output unless we have people, labor, and capital productively being utilized. But I want to say something about the unemployment rate, because that's where Obama claims a victory. Well, when he had his so-called stimulus, the unemployment rate was up near 10%. Once the stimulus stopped and we entered this 5-year spending freeze, that's when the unemployment rate began to fall.
You're not saying that caused it.
I think that when you have smaller government as a share of GDP, I mean, nowhere near where, as a good libertarian, I want government to be, but simply having government on the federal level shrink from 24.4% of GDP to 20.3% of GDP, that's a real achievement. And so, yes, I make fun of Republicans, but they did that. And I make fun of them, but the Ryan budget for 4 years in a row included real Medicare and Medicaid reform. Now, Obama would veto it if the House and Senate both passed it, so we still have a long way to go, but maybe I'm just grading on a curve, but I actually think there's a little bit of hope out there.
And can I just mention one thing about the stimulus plan? The president promised that we were going to have 4% GDP growth year after year. We had half of that, and he likes to take credit for the stimulus. But, of course, the stimulus ended in 2011. All of the economic growth has occurred after the stimulus. But what have we gotten since the economic recovery began? We had sequestration. That's the word that nobody likes to talk about.
Which was supposed to be horrible and kill the
Oh, yeah, exactly.
And in fact, that's exactly what Obama loves to go after Republicans for, because they're cynical, they didn't cooperate, they didn't work together, they're not doing it right. I think, though, when you say Republicans froze spending, it sounds, even though you're not glamorizing it, you're still making it sound better than it is. I mean, they froze spending almost accidentally. They froze it because they were kind of just being jerks.
Well, also, you had spending shoot up so much in 2009 because of the corrupt TARP bailout and the fake stimulus. So,
right. I mean, it's horrible to say Obama is right. The Republicans were being obstructionist and just kind of a pain in the butt. Generally, it is a happy accident.
But and let's not forget that the
first
GDP is socialist because it includes government spending as portion of growth, and we all know that that's BS.
The deficit is another thing that the president brags about. I have reduced the deficit by 2/3. But again, that's because in his first year, there was $800 billion in stimulus spending.
We've had federal spending as a share of GDP. It could go below 20% in 2015. That's down from 23.4%. That's actually a really steep drop. So when we're
still $488 billion deficit.
True.
But the key thing to realize is that the deficit fell because of policies Obama opposed. The debt limit fights, the government shutdowns, and sequestration. Now, again, it's not nearly as far as we need to go, but that little bit of progress has occurred in spite of Obama, not because of him.
I also don't think people realize that paragraph of good economic news is so laboriously crafted by presidential speechwriters, right? It is the ultimate in cherry picking. You have this vast raft of economic data, and what happens is that a team of speechwriters go back and forth and they say, can we say this? Well, that's not quite true. Can we say this? Well, that's also not quite true.
They say, look how much oil we're producing at home now. But again, the president opposed much of that.
He didn't sign the Keystone XL pipeline. He said in his first State of the Union address in 2009, we need to start looking at getting energy independence. We need to get off of oil from Saudi Arabia. And yet he could have done it, but he didn't.
On public lands, there's been hardly any increase. All the increases on private lands, mostly from fracking, which his people oppose.
Right.
It's a tribute to private sector ingenuity, which I think is one of the themes of what's wrong with Obama. He always thinks government is the answer. But you look across the ocean, you look at all the European welfare states that are in various degrees of economic and fiscal decay, and Obama, whether it's minimum wages, parental leave, class warfare, tax hikes, more dependency, he wants to make us like the Greeks and the French and the Italians, except we don't get the good wines.
The president said several things that sound reasonable if you don't listen closely.
Rebecca isn't asking for a handout, but she is asking that we look for more ways to help families get ahead.
Isn't that a contradiction?
I think Rebecca's asking for a handout. I mean, she's not asking for, a check that moment from the president. But, that isn't to say that she isn't as bad as the kind of big corporations that Democrats love to demonize when they ask for special treatment, when they ask for a little extra deal, a little extra help, because after all, they're doing something important, just like Rebecca.
Catherine, Austin, Dan, thank you. We'll come back to you later in the show. To join this argument, please follow me on Twitter at FBN Stossel. Use that hashtag SOTU, State of the Union, or like my Facebook page so you can post on my wall. Next, what does one of my favorite left-wingers think about what the president said? And we'll look back at the president's previous State of the Union promises. How many has he kept?
Our approach would preserve the right of Americans who have insurance to keep their doctor and their plane.
Now that we libertarians weighed in on the president's speech, let's hear from someone from the left. Newsday columnist Ellis Hennekins. So, do you like what you heard?
It was a feisty Obama. It was a liberated Obama. It was an Obama who said, you know what? I'm the president for the next 2 years. I'm not going to just get slapped around. I'm going to do some stuff. Yes, I liked it.
Well, I agree with your characterization. He speaks well. And tonight, the president again offered Americans more free stuff.
I'm sending this Congress a bold new plan to lower the cost of community college to zero.
You like this?
That's a bargain I want. Yeah, zero sounds terrific to me. Listen, John, we give people in our society, because we think it's the right thing to do, education up to senior year in college. We don't make you pay a nickel for it. We have learned now, as we're trying to get our economy
senior year
going.
in high school.
Up to high school, right? And then now we're saying, you know what? Maybe we ought to add a couple of years to that. We need that to
How do we
compete in
pay
the
for
world.
all this stuff?
Well, there are some ways we can make sure that folks pay their fair share who haven't been, close some of those loopholes, make sure that the people at the very top who've been getting away with paying so little just kick in a little bit more.
And community college.
Yeah.
Right now, most kids don't graduate in 2 years or 4 years.
Then they won't get the deal. You have to perform well. You have to graduate in time. You got to get good grades.
But you don't have to perform well. If you're in college, you can just keep going to college for free. If it's not working now, why does he always want more of it? Why do you always want more of these programs that rarely work?
Well, listen, I want to set them up in a way that we will be sure that they do work, that we won't pay people
Doesn't
unless they
government
succeed.
always say that and fail?
Well, no. I mean, listen, it's an imperfect thing. The private sector doesn't solve everything perfectly either, but I don't think we should throw up our hands and say we're just not good enough as Americans to achieve this anymore.
And we libertarians don't propose that. We say if you leave us alone, we will achieve. But tonight we heard the phrase a lot, middle-class economics.
Yes, I like that phrase.
And they must have poll tested it because it was spoken often.
John, listen,
what does it even mean?
John, ask the folks here. I mean, middle-class people are behind. They're struggling. They hear the economy is better.
There's
The numbers
economics.
say it.
There's not poor economics,
Well,
rich economics, middle-class
not
economics.
Not really. Not really. This doesn't happen. This distribution of wealth, it doesn't happen by accident. God didn't do this. We have a tax code that rewards certain things and punishes other people. Let's get it back into whack so it's fair to regular people.
But it's already the rich pay much more than the poor do, and the reason there's a disparity is when people are free, some get very rich.
Yeah, but there's a reason in the last few years, John, that those folks at the very, very top, they're getting all the goodies. We don't want that to happen.
The stock market went up.
Well, you know what?
And
do you just want to say it's fine? 99% of the people don't deserve anything because the folks at the top learn to job the system in a way that benefits only them. We know that's been going on, don't you?
I don't think they job the system. I don't think it benefits
Lobbyists.
only them. And I think the wealth does spread if people are free.
Well, yes. But, you know, government doesn't have no role in this, right?
It's got plenty in this country.
And you know what? Let's be sure that regular people have a voice at that table too. That we're getting, if the corporations and the 1% are going to get all those goodies, you know what? Send my kids to community college. Let me make sure that I've got a child tax credit. If I'm sick, make sure that I can, I'll stay home and get paid.
Move on to something that we may agree on.
Oh, good.
On Cuba, we are ending a policy that was long past its expiration date. When what you're doing doesn't work for 50 years, it's time to try something new.
All right, so I agree. It hasn't worked for 50 years, but Marco Rubio says this entire policy shift is based on a lie that access to money and goods will translate to political freedom.
Well, you know what? It's worked everywhere else in the world way better than it's worked in Cuba. The thing in Florida has to do with a certain narrow political issue there that, frankly, doesn't really apply even in Florida anymore. Let's move on. Let's try something different.
Shouldn't they try to work with Congress on things like immigration as well? These executive orders, don't they bother you?
Well, it does. I mean, it wouldn't be my first choice, and I suspect it's not his first choice. But here you are. You're the president, right? You have certain legal authorities. The law actually says there's some stuff you can do on your own. Congress just says, no, nothing, never. You like it, we hate it. At some point, wouldn't you want to say, you know, I wish you guys would work with me, but if you won't, I'm just not going to do nothing.
So I'm by myself going to basically legalize all these immigrants and invite more people to come into the country by executive order.
Actually, I think it's prosecutorial authority would be the way that I would look at it. You know, you can't send everybody away. Why don't we send the criminals away and not the nice families?
I happen to agree with you. Thank you, Ellis Anakin.
Always a pleasure,
Coming up,
sir.
Our live studio audience weighs in, and we'll talk about how President Obama has fixed America all by himself. We are back with our studio audience and our liberty-loving panel. Economist Dan Mitchell, Reason Magazine's Catherine Mangu Ward, and Austin Peterson, creator of the Libertarian Republic website. Here, it's reporting on the free college plan, which the website says flunks the Republican test. Meaning what?
Well, from the man who promised you free health care comes free college, right? Students spend more on books than they do on classes. These are giveaways to colleges, not to students, and then they just use this to turn around and raise the rates.
I agree. Sometimes I think the president doesn't listen to himself even. He said he wants more workplace rules. He complained that America is...
We are the only advanced country on earth that doesn't guarantee paid sick leave.
It's probably true as far as I know. But then just 2 pages later in his speech, he said this.
America has put more people back to work than Europe, Japan, and all advanced economies combined.
So he doesn't get the connection?
I assume that his speechwriters are giggling in a basement someplace, that they pulled one over on the president because he didn't realize that he was contradicting himself. Yeah, we are doing better than Europe because we don't have as much government intervention as Europe. And that's why our job creation numbers are better. I mean, look at the double-digit unemployment rates. Look at the 40 to 50% youth unemployment rates throughout Europe. Here's a news flash. When government passes rules to make it more expensive to hire someone, guess what happens? Fewer people get hired. I realize that makes me heartless.
Because they call it the Healthy Families Act. You're against healthy families.
Yeah, I guess it's totally
also
heartless.
Against workplace flexibility, which is the other term that's clearly been tested to death. And what they use for
it's
this...
employer inflexibility.
And it's right. It's actually the exact opposite. What they're saying is, there's been far too much flexibility here. We're going to have to clamp down on that right now. New rules from the feds for everybody.
They always make the joke. They're always like, libertarians, if you don't like government, well, why don't you just move to Somalia? But then I just say, well, if you love government, why don't you move to North Korea?
All right, let's venture into something that TV programs fear to approach, net neutrality, which the president briefly talked about. In this case, we're getting no great message from Republicans either. I noticed Senator John Thune and Representative Fred Upton have a bill. They want to they like that broadband providers remain neutral. We all like neutrality. That sounds good. This bill would prohibit them from blocking websites. We don't want them blocking websites. It would also prohibit them from charging companies for faster delivery.
Yeah, we got a problem, John. There is an army of communist nerds on the internet who are pushing net neutrality. And these are people who either don't understand the laws of supply and demand, or they just want to push it away like President Obama does. The thing with internet neutrality is if Netflix is, if most people are on Netflix and it's 60% of all traffic is Netflix, well, of course you should have to pay more. And then you pass the cost on to the consumer.
Charging companies for faster delivery is a way to inspire people to create more pipes for faster delivery.
Right.
It's also an easy case to make when you put it very simply, which is what we should be defending is the status quo. The internet should be a place that's free, that's unregulated. We already have gotten some amazing stuff as a result of that, and it's insane to me that someone would look at the internet and be like, that's not working. We're going to need to fix that one up, right? It's the best thing that's ever happened lately, literally.
2 points. Fred Upton is Kate Upton's father, so we need to forgive him for a few transgressions. But the second and more relevant public policy point is, why would we want to take a tremendously successful technology and turn it into a regulated public utility, like a sewer system or something? That's very bad news for America.
Right. One of the things we've always got to be careful of, too, is the never let a crisis go to waste crowd, because every time a terror threat happens or whenever there's a cyber attack or something, politicians always move in and say, well, let's go ahead and pass net neutrality. That will help with cybersecurity.
Didn't you hear, though? Obama is going to protect our children's
But these
online
little
data.
companies are afraid that the big companies will prevent them from growing. And
I think it's so much more likely that government will prevent them from speaking, right? This is always the case. And yes, perhaps a big company might try to exercise power, but far, far, far more likely is that a bunch of the idiots in that room tonight will decide to do it themselves.
Thank you, panel. Early this week, we asked them to study previous State of the Union speeches to look at the promises the president made. What did he keep? What didn't he? Did he keep any? President Obama's State of the Union speeches, he says, I'll do this and I will do that, but how often does he actually do it? In 2010, I perked up when I heard the president say this.
We will continue to go through the budget, line by line, page by page, to eliminate programs that we can't afford and don't work.
But what happened? Our panel is back to dissect some of the promises. Line by line, they looked for programs to cut. Dan, did they find many?
Every single year, Obama has proposed more spending than Congress ultimately implemented. Now, as we talked about earlier, there has been progress on government spending, shrinking as a share of GDP, but it's only because of policies that the president was very opposed to, the shutdowns, the debt limit fights, the sequestration. So, yes, we've made progress, but not because of his promise.
And this line by line has never happened. The president also promised he'd get rid of stupid rules. He says things like this.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
Austin?
In his first term, he added 106 new federal regulations, and we're still tallying them up for the second term. You know, the president in his...
We have a graph that shows the number that it's increased. It always goes up.
It always goes up, you know, and in 2009, the president also said, well, we need to get rid of regulations that force health care costs to go up. So we got Obamacare, and I went from paying $96 a month for my premium to $396 a month for my premium. So how is that helping health care costs go down?
And this is not a Democratic thing. President Bush hired 90,000 new regulators. He promised to close Guantanamo Bay. Catherine?
He sure did. And you know, it's funny. He promises it every year in the State of the Union. This is the year. And every year he gets to be president for a whole year. And he still doesn't manage to actually close Guantanamo. Now, I get
this time he said there were 250 prisoners. Now there are 122.
Right. He's also going to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, he has drawn down troops significantly, but not entirely. I mean, I think this is the kind of thing where you can always say, well, look, I did a little bit better. You know, you're the most powerful man in the free world. You could probably close a prison.
Well, it's not like FDR putting Japanese in internment camps quite so much, but what we have seen is that the people who have been released from Guantanamo Bay have been captured on the battlefield again. So we're not even administering justice properly because the president is endangering our national security by having this prison there.
Administering justice properly would be bringing them to American prisons and giving them American due process.
Right.
And while we're administering that justice properly, we could go about reforming American prisons, which he promised to do in this speech. We'll see.
Right.
But then we wouldn't spend $3 million on each Guantanamo prisoner, as he said. He promised that he would increase regulation of banks and increase taxes on the rich. He did that.
Yeah, he did. Now, this is what's very frustrating to me. He pushed through a bunch of class warfare tax hikes as part of the fiscal cliff deal. He pushed through a bunch of class warfare tax hikes as part of Obamacare. And then he has the gall to get up tonight and talk about, oh, America's not competitive enough. Well, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. We have probably the third or fourth highest capital gains tax in the world, and Obama's proposing to increase it. He's proposing to increase the death tax. We have one of the highest death taxes in the world. These are not recipes for increased competitive. When you're punishing saving and investing, you're actually hurting workers because you're going to have less capital formation, and that's what drives productivity, which drives wages.
And when they do polls, when they do polls on small businesses, the number one problem that small businesses report isn't that they need more sales. That's the second biggest problem. The number one problem are all the regulations that they have to follow, all of the red tape. So if Obama really cared about middle-class economics, he would get rid of some of these regulations that harm small businesses.
And yet what I heard in the speech was a sort of arrogance about he knows best. He said, we need more employers to see beyond next quarter's earnings, recognize that investing in their workforce is in their company's long-term interest.
All of this is, though,
the company doesn't know?
All of this seems secondary to me to the fact that what he says over and over and always says in his State of the Union is things like, it is the job of government to help working class Americans. That's wrong. It's the job of government to help all Americans. It's the job of government to help Americans mostly by leaving them alone, but at the very least to apply equally the laws across all classes, all people. This notion that somehow Obama can see who needs his help and administer it in a sort of precise way to fix the economy is appalling.
There also seemed to be some magical thinking. He said, talking about Keystone, let's set our sights higher than a single oil pipeline. pass infrastructure that would create more than 30 times as many jobs.
The president likes to talk about how we need to cut back on pollution and we need to have affordable energy. But what he doesn't understand is that the trains that are being used right now to transport oil from Canada through the United States create more pollution than the pipeline that would be built. And we have dozens of these pipelines. Why can't we build one more?
I said some nice things about Republicans earlier. It's time for me to rectify that. A lot of Republicans in Washington are now proposing to do a gas tax to fund more Washington centralized highway spending and mass transit spending and pork barrel projects. We shouldn't have a Department of Transportation in Washington at all. And these Republicans, having just won a landslide election promising to be anti-big government, for them to say the American people should pay higher gas taxes, that's outrageous.
Wait, so who would build the roads? Without government, who would build the roads?
State governments and private people. But wouldn't you rather have a carbon tax than the income tax?
If we could ever trust politicians to permanently eliminate a really bad tax, yeah, in theory, I might take a less bad tax, but I don't trust them.
Thank you. Dan, Austin, Catherine, coming up. My State of the Union address. I'll say what the president should have said. But first, your questions for us. Now, your comments or questions, here to answer them are economist Dan Mitchell, Reason Magazine's Catherine Mangu-Ward, and Newsday columnist Ellis Hennigan. First, from my Facebook page, David Dalton asks, what would be the downside of instituting a flat tax and doing away with the expense of the IRS?
That's easy. I mean, the people under a graduated system who can afford the most are asked to give the most, and people who can't don't have to give so much. That's fair.
Assuming we want faster economic growth in a more competitive country, a flat tax is a much less destructive way for the government to raise revenue. But here's the catch. There's no way to have a good tax system unless we figure out some way in the long run to restrain the growth and the burden of government spending.
And a flat tax still means the rich pay more.
Yeah, if you make 10 times as much as your neighbor, you pay 10 times more. If Bill Gates makes 1 million times more than me. Yeah, and there's a zero bracket amount for the poor, so they don't pay tax under the current system or the flat tax.
Let's go to the audience. Who's first here? Yes, sir.
Yes, isn't it likely that with this proposed funding of 2 years of college education, that it would just contribute to the growing higher education bubble?
I would say it's more than likely. It is 100% certain that is what will happen.
That they'll just raise prices.
Right. I mean, if you subsidize something, you're going to get more of it, and it's going to be more expensive, and that's what's going to happen. We will get more people in college. It's going to cost more money.
Yes, it'll cost more money, but don't we want more people in college? We need training. We need to compete in the jumps. And you know what? Education's a good thing. Let's be for it.
Who's next here? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to know what risks you see to prolonged income inequality and if there's a role for government to play here.
I think there's a major problem with corruption and cronyism in Washington. When people get the sense that you get rich by trading on your connections in D.C., rather than getting rich because you're a successful entrepreneur or, heck, a good baseball player or whatever, that's what undermines people's faith in the system. I don't think the average American harbors any resentment of, say, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. They do resent the cronyist, the Wall Street bailout artists, the export-import bank subsidy suckers. These are the things we have to worry about in terms of eroding the confidence in our system.
You know what else people don't like? It's when they feel like no matter how hard they work, they don't have a fair chance of getting ahead. I know a lot of people. Today? I think it is increasingly America today, and I think the numbers bear it out. All that money's parked up at the top, and you guys are all working hard, and a lot of you aren't getting as far as you deserve.
I think the problem is giving people false hope that we can remedy the income inequality with stuff like increasing the minimum wage. I mean, if you say, oh, well, all we have to do is pass a rule and it'll all go away, it gives a very false sense of what kind of problem we're actually facing.
But that person who was making this is all of a sudden making this.
The person who was making this has no job, yeah.
No, actually, there's really, the evidence says that people just get paid better.
That was an awesome use of studies show right there. It was the evidence says everyone makes all the money and it's fine.
Let's not forget, yes, there are very rich people and there are very poor people, but they're not the same people. There's still mobility. Some of the rich are becoming poor. Some of the poor do get very rich in America.
You know, I've heard that. I haven't met too many, but I think it could happen.
Who's next? Here, yes, sir.
Yes, my question is, who's going to pay for this big, expensive government?
You. Thanks.
Well, we got him.
Good short answer there. Who's next there? Yes, ma'am.
Can bipartisan solutions to things like infrastructure, education, or immigration really ever be found, or are we really just at the whim of the majority party?
There are all kinds of bipartisan solutions that are out there all the time, and they are virtually always bad ones. Bipartisan solutions are ones where you've bought off both sides and everybody signs on. It doesn't mean it's good policy.
Oh, that's so depressing. That can't be true. I mean, I think as Americans, we actually agree. Don't you want to have decent roads and some mass transit and a good education system? And most people can agree with that, I think.
You and Obama are both trying to combat my cynicism.
Come on,
and you
come
will
on
not
in.
win
The water
today.
is warm.
We
It's
don't
good.
agree on who will build those things.
Bipartisanship like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. During the Clinton years, we got bipartisanship for welfare reform, for a capital gains tax cut, for reducing the burden of government spending down to less than 18% of GDP.
You guys
Those were all
liked it then.
bipartisan.
You guys liked it then.
But during the Bush years, we got bipartisanship for TARP and things like that. So you have to look at the underlying policy and not just create this silly little shrine to, oh, if the stupid party and evil party both agree on something, it must be good.
One more question here. Who has the microphone? Yes, ma'am.
We are in the process of normalizing diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the U.S. needs to hold Cuba accountable for implementing true changes. How does the president plan on doing this?
And we're out of time to even, we can't solve it, the president can't solve it. I hope he works it out. Thank you, Ellis, Catherine, Dan. Next, what the president should have said. My State of the Union address. I'll save America. We just heard President Obama give a State of the Union speech for the 6th time. I see a pattern now. The president says, my administration has done great things. America's better because of me and my government rearranging life. Give me a break. In my dreams, President Obama says something more like this. I heard you voters in November when you took control of the Senate away from my party and me. I get it. I overreached. I was arrogant. I imposed Obamacare on a nation that was deeply divided about it. I ruled through executive orders instead of legislation. I threw money at my cronies who invested in so-called green energy, and I promised that America would build a million electric cars. It's absurd. I'll give up payments to the green energy industry if you Republicans stop coddling defense contractors. How's that for a deal? I pretended that higher taxes on rich people would solve America's financial problems, but more taxes won't. There aren't enough rich people to take money from to make much of a difference. And anyway, some of those rich people create good things. We're already spending almost $4 trillion. My government doesn't need more money. We need to spend less on bad programs. I should have known this. I've been in government for years now. I know how badly government works. The last thing I should try to do is make it bigger. In fact, with you Republicans now in control of Congress, it's time I worked with you to shrink government. Right on. If we shrink government, we might even be able to start digging our way out of the debt hole we're in. Heck, if we just slow the growth of government to 2% a year, we'd be out of trouble. But I never even tried to accomplish that. I was drunk on the idea of promising all of you free stuff. Free college, free phones, free birth control. I told people all good things come from government, but I know that's nonsense. From now on, we should put an end to bailouts of all kinds. If businesses screw up, they should accept the consequences just like ordinary people who spend recklessly. Main Street should never again be forced to rescue Wall Street. I expanded government's involvement in health care. That was a mistake. We should reduce government's involvement. And that also includes Medicare. I know Medicare is very popular, but it is unsustainable. Give current retirees the coverage we promised them, but younger people should pay for their own health care. And to help them do that, let's make America richer by abolishing most regulations, including mine. Most of government's rules are not needed. They strangle opportunity. I'll approve the Keystone Pipeline and encourage states to allow fracking. The more I think about it, the more Congress and I could transform America for the better just by getting out of America's way. The state of our union will truly be strong if the state is strictly limited. Well, maybe someday a president will say something like that. I won't hold my breath. Someday, though. And before we leave you tonight, a programming note. Starting next week, new episodes of Stossel will air every Friday at 9 p.m. on Fox Business. No longer Thursday. I'm moving to Friday, same time, same channel. Hope to see you then. Good night.